Good afternoon, everyone. Laura Young here from the Department of Psychiatry, UT Tyler Health Science Center here in Tyler, Texas. I have with me today Dr. Stephanie Simmons, who will be facilitating a session we have done previously, but one that has gotten a lot of positive response. And so certainly wanted to share this with you again. The session today, click here, how internet use and social media affect children. Let me introduce you to Dr. Simmons, who is part of our department here. So Dr. Simmons is a child and adolescent psychologist here at the University of Texas at Tyler Health Science Center. She holds a doctorate in clinical psychology from Baylor University. She completed her pre-doctoral internship in community mental health in Cincinnati, Ohio, before returning to Texas for her postdoctoral residency in pediatric psychology at Texas Scottish Rite Hospital for Children. Dr. Simmons currently serves as the training director for the psychology internship program here at UT Tyler Health Science Center, and also provides outpatient psychological services to children, adolescents, and their families. She is passionate about training and education, specifically in the areas of trauma prevention and intervention. And we're very fortunate to have Dr. Simmons be willing to share with us her expertise in this area. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the video over to Dr. Simmons, and we'll have her get started here in just a moment. While she's pulling her screen up, if you have questions during this session, please feel free at any time to place those questions in the chat box, and we will get to them towards the end of the session. We'll also open up the phone lines so that you can go ahead and ask questions. We'll ask you to unmute yourself at that time. If I sound like I'm on some type of radio show, we'll open up the phone lines. Anyway, Dr. Simmons, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you for providing a session today.
Of course, thank you. Can you see my slides okay?
No problem.
Beautiful. So like Laura said, I am Stephanie Simmons. I'm one of the psychologists here at the Health Science Center, and very excited to talk a little bit today about internet use and social media, just because this is such a quickly evolving area that every single one of our patients and families are exposed to on a daily basis. So I have no disclosures, but a little bit about what we're going to be trying to cover today. So we're going to quickly go over the effects of social media and internet usage on children and teenagers. We're going to talk about screen time in general, but then also more specifically social media, gaming, as well as pornography use. We're going to talk about strategies to improve healthy browsing habits that apply both to all of us, as well as all of the families that we work with, and then talk a little bit about practical ways for parents to monitor and encourage safe internet usage in the home. So my guess is that we've probably all seen a slide or a picture similar to this, but I figured that I would start out by just quickly reviewing the recommended screen time by age. So this is from the Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. The AAP, a lot of different organizations put out very similar recommendations. But overall, it's recommended that up until 18 months, babies are not viewing any screen time outside of an occasional video chat with an adult. Once we hit toddlers, we can start viewing about 1 hour a day of specifically educational programming, but it's recommended that that always is co-watched with a caregiver. Now, as you can see, as children get older, the recommended screen time does increase. So in young children before they hit school, about 0 to 3 hours, ideally, of educational programming, about 2 hours of non-educational programming for kids and teens, and then 2 to 4 hours of non-educational programming for teens and adults. So it varies, kind of continues to increase. But I want us all to keep these numbers in mind as we continue the presentation. So as I mentioned, we kind of have our allotted recommended screen time. But what we know is that kids and teens in America are spending more time than ever using screens and social media. Unsurprisingly, the number of hours spent online rose pretty sharply during COVID. The overall screen time use increased by 17% in just 2 years. And that was a much more rapid growth pace compared to previous years. On average, tweens, so our kids ages about 8 to 12, are averaging about 5.5 hours of screen time per day. And teenagers are averaging over 8.5 hours a day. So if we think back to that recommended like 2 to 4 hours, we are far outpacing that. We also know that many kids turned to screens for entertainment, connection to friends during the pandemic. So that's important to keep in mind. I included just some graphics that I find particularly interesting. So on the right, if you can see it, it just lists kind of increases and decreases in what social media sites are being used. So you can see that YouTube leads the pack. 95% of teenagers say that they are using YouTube on a fairly regular basis. TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat are all on the rise, while some of our other social media apps like Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr have decreased over time. The charts on the left are just give us a little bit more information about demographic information related to screen time use. So a couple of big takeaways. Screen use is highest among kids from low-income families, as well as children of color. So we often see our lower income families turning to screens more as a way to occupy, a way to babysit children. And on average, boys are spending more time on screen compared to girls. And the hypothesis is that that is largely related to internet gaming. So why does this matter? We're all on screens. We're all using our phones. Why do we need to be worried about it? So too much screen time can contribute to some fairly negative things. One of the big things is that the more time you're spending on screens, the less time you're spending engaged in other activities. So you're spending less time sleeping, less time on homework, which can contribute to lower grades in school. You're reading less, you're spending less time with your friends and family. You're not outdoors being physically active, which can contribute to weight problems. We also know that increased screen time can contribute to mood and mental health problems, as well as poor self-image and body image issues. And I'll talk a little bit more about those when we get specific into social media. Given the instant gratification nature of screen time and social media and the internet, some children will develop a fear of missing out or just that increased need for instant gratification. And they spend less time learning other ways to relax and have fun. So I'm sure you've heard kids, as soon as the screens go off, saying they're bored, they have no idea what to do. And we're really seeing a trend towards children really struggling to find ways to relax and entertain themselves in the absence of screen time. I wanted to talk a little bit about adolescent vulnerabilities because as we remember, that screen time usage tends to increase during that adolescent time, which is a really sensitive period of brain development between the ages about 10 and 19. So with or without screen time and the internet, adolescent brains are undergoing a lot of changes. We know that risk-taking behaviors and impulsivity peak during this time, and well-being experiences the greatest fluctuation. Adolescents are developing their identities, their self-worth, and the brain is especially sensitive to social pressures, peer opinions, and peer comparisons. We also see that this is the most likely time for mental health challenges to start to emerge. So specifically, social media usage has been initially associated with some pretty distinct changes in the brain. And I listed some of the specific areas, but there are changes in the amygdala related to emotional learning and behavior, a fair number of changes in the prefrontal cortex that controls all of our higher order thinking. So our impulse control, our emotional regulation, our social skills, all of those fun things that are already starting to come online during adolescence, and in the research at least, have been affected by social media usage and internet usage. Individuals and adolescents, especially who use more screen time, have an increased sensitivity to rewards and punishments, and have a heightened emotional sensitivity to online interactions and communications. So instead of being kind of more resilient to those online interactions, tend to be a bit more emotionally reactive. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that social media is all terrible and all bad, because it's not. And there's actually a fair amount of research to support that there are potential benefits of social media use. I will caveat this with the influence of social media is shaped by a lot of complex factors. So that includes the amount of screen time, the type of content that's being consumed, what those online activities and interactions are looking like, and the degree to which internet usage disrupts normal activities like sleep and physical activity. It's also important to be aware that children and adolescents are affected differently by the internet and social media, just from others. So that's going to depend on their individual strengths and vulnerabilities, their cultural backgrounds, socioeconomic factors. So really the big takeaway is that no one child is going to be affected by the internet and social media the same as any other. However, there is some broad agreement in the literature that social media has potential benefits. So one of the biggest benefits is that ability to form and maintain friendships online and develop social connections. Having an online community gives you a lot more opportunities to have positive interactions with more diverse peer groups that are available offline. So this is an important source of social support, particularly so like in East Texas, where we live in smaller communities, and it may be a lot harder to come by those more diverse peer groups who share different identity factors or different interests. Those social and positive interactions are often serve as a buffer against stress, especially for youth who are marginalized. So are individuals who identify as racially, ethnically, socially, sexually, or gender minorities, and may particularly benefit from having connections to other people who share similar identities. So for example, studies have shown that social media may support mental health and well-being, particularly in LGBTQ youth, by enabling connection, identity exploration, and social support. Another study with adolescent girls of color found that 7 out of the 10 adolescents found that they encountered positivity and felt that it was affirming to their identity related to race with their social media interactions. When we take a step back and look at the larger population, we're still seeing some pretty positive impacts. 58% of adolescents feels that social media helps them feel more accepted. Almost 70% like having people that can support them through tough times. 70% like having a place where they can show their creative side, and 80% feel more connected to what's going on in their friend's life. So those are pretty good numbers. I will also put a plug that some early research suggests that social media-based and other digital mental health interventions may be helpful in connecting adolescents to behavioral health care. So we always like that. So while these are all great benefits, unfortunately, a 2022 survey suggests that kids were not primarily using screens to stay in touch with their peers. So if we kind of look at all the potential benefits, they're largely based on using social media and screen time in a way that increases connection and community. However, teens report spending more than 3 hours a day watching television and nearly 2 hours a day gaming. So that leads us into some potential harms related to social media. So we talked about some of these related to screen time in general, in the sense that the more time you're spending online, the less time you are spending working on homework, sleeping, spending time with family and friends in person, engaged in extracurriculars, all of those fun things. However, social media also runs the risk of exposing kids to some pretty specific and targeted information. So it can lead to information that is biased and not correct. I'm sure we've all had this experience on social media where we've seen something and, our adult experience sometimes gives us the ability to say, that doesn't sound quite right, or maybe that's only for one viewpoint, whereas adolescents are much more likely to just read that and take it as fact. It also can negatively impact a lot of mental health and especially body image. So just exposing adolescents to people's lives and bodies that just aren't realistic. Adolescents can run the risk of sharing too much personal information if they are not taught very specifically what information is safe to share, which opens the door for risk of exposure to online predators. And there is always the risk of cyberbullying and spreading of harmful rumors. And I start specifically we know that mental health and well-being are negatively impacted by social media. So a large 2013 survey found that spending 3 hours per day on social media, which a lot of our adolescents are doing, was linked to a significantly higher risk of mental health concerns. And this has been replicated in several different studies. Similarly, overall screen time has been linked to depression and suicidal behavior in adolescents. The correlation likely depends on how youth are using social media. So, for example, viewing illegal acts of self-harm, eating disorders are obviously going to contribute more strongly to mental health concerns. It's especially important to note that online content may be even more risky for adolescents who already have a mental health condition. Discrimination, cyberbullying, biased information, all of those things can exacerbate pre-existing anxiety and depression. So there are some specific things that we can talk to parents about screen time in general, as well as specifically to social media. So we kind of already talked about, we can, as allied health professionals, can make screen time recommendations that are developmentally appropriate. And these are the same things that we talked about of, as children get older, we can start to introduce non-educational programming, but really be below 2, that should be very, very limited. We also want to encourage families to turn off screens during family meals, family outings, to be sure that we are fostering those in-person connections rather than distracting with online connections. We encourage parents to learn about and use parental controls, and I will mention a few of specific ones in just a few minutes. Parents want to avoid using screens to soothe children and to babysit children. So we don't want to be using them as pacifiers, as babysitters to stop tantrums. It really should be something that is completely removed from a self-soothing mechanism. And screens should always be turned off and removed from bedrooms 30 to 60 minutes before bedtime to ensure that that good circadian rhythm is still in place. Kids are being allowed to wind down and get to sleep in a healthy manner. So specific to social media, there are also some things that we can help parents learn about and implement in their homes. So one of the most important things that parents can do is be aware of what their children are watching, what advertising they're being exposed to, and making sure that it's age appropriate. So this should all be monitored. We highly, highly encourage families to keep computers and any screens in a public area to make it much easier for parents to monitor what is happening online. Parents should also be having regular conversations with their children about what they're seeing and what they are doing online. That enables them to point out good behavior, so cooperation and friendship and concern for others, but then also to process through and discuss maybe the not so helpful behaviors. We really want parents to be encouraging other hobbies, so sports, music, art, anything that doesn't involve screens. And one of the most one of the biggest things parents can do is really be watching their own screen time and social media usage. Kids are little sponges, as we all know, and they're going to be watching what their parents are doing. So if parents are consistently, sitting scrolling through Facebook or TikTok, that's what is going to be kind of established as the norm in the household. So we want parents to be very aware of what they are modeling for their kids. Parents should also be talking to kids very proactively about online privacy and safety, so that we are understanding what is okay to share, what's not okay to share, and who is safe to interact with. Parents, and we really encourage conversations between co-parents as well, or co-caregivers if we have step parents or grandparents or foster families, whoever that might be. But actively having conversations about their values and when each individual child is ready for a personal device and what personal device they're ready for. So I've heard some families, they will start them out with a phone that only calls mom and dad, but that may not mean that they're ready for a smartphone with access to internet and gaming and social media. So you can make those different decisions of when they're ready, as well as what level they are ready for. And then finally, we want to just encourage screen time and social media usage that encourages connections with others. As we talked about, that's where a lot of the benefits lie, is in that connection and that positive support from a community. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of parental control apps out there. I pulled these just from a recent CNN article on the best parental control apps because I have to continuously figure out which ones are out there. There are a lot that require some sort of small payment, but there are some free ones out there as well. So I really just encourage families to, do their research and figure out what is going to be the right fit for them. But these are very, very useful apps and very useful controls to have in place proactively rather than waiting for something inappropriate to happen. Okay. I'm going to pause before we jump into video games and just address questions. So would the emotional reactivity be potentially due to the reliance of online friendships as opposed to online friends? I think potentially yes. I will be honest that this research is fairly new. And so there's still a lot to be done. But I do think that there is a strong possibility that when we are, rather than using online friendships as a way to grow the social support, I think some kids are just replacing in-person social support with online friendships. And I think that probably could be when we're seeing more of that emotional reactivity, just because we don't have the same social cues in place to kind of, I guess, help kids learn to respond to that. So good question. Okay. So video games, this is a question we get asked a lot, is how do video games affect youth, and should youth even be playing video games in the first place? So as with everything, there are benefits and there are potential risks, and there's not a super straightforward answer of yes or no, kids should or should not be playing video games. So some of the benefits, with some video games, we can see improved performance on cognitive skills, such as impulse control and working memory, as well as improved problem solving, strategizing, and flexibility. Some games can help improve hand-eye coordination. This is why I personally am terrible at video games and strongly dislike them. But that's besides the point. There are some physical activity-oriented games. So, the dance-related games or things like that can improve body health and reduce stress. And cooperative games can increase and encourage pro-social behavior that can have a positive effect on brain structure. So that's the good. The potential bad. As we've talked about, playing video games takes away from time from other things, which can contribute to less sleep, poor academic performance, low mood, low well-being. We also know that there is an increased risk of inattention. Video games are highly, highly stimulating. There's noises, there's colors, things are fast. And so when kids are getting a lot of exposure to that high stimulation, then being put in a low stimulating environment, such as a classroom, can be very jarring and increase that inattentive behavior. We do know that violent video games can contribute to aggressive behavior in kids, both in their frequency of actual aggressive behavior and their decreased sensitivity to aggression as a whole. Long periods of gameplay can contribute to childhood obesity since we're not outside, we're not being physically active. And we may have worse social skills because we are not engaged with friends in real life. We may just be talking to people online. So some of the risks, and I think parents overall have to decide, when do the benefits outweigh the risks? But some general recommendations to ensure that parents are making video game usage as safe as possible for their kids. Preschool age children, we really want to largely avoid video games. So we don't really even want to be thinking about introducing video games until probably school age. Parents should always be aware of the ratings of games, but beyond just the rating that they print on, the box, really what is actually happening in the video game, and what the child is being exposed to. So because of that, we really encourage families to play video games with their kids. That allows them to be very aware of what is happening on the screen, as well as, like we said, to have those conversations about what's helpful and what's not so helpful. Parents need to be setting very clear rules about video games, both in the home and outside the home. So kids should understand what they are allowed to play and how much they are allowed to play, both at home and if they go to a friend's house. Because those two settings are going to differ pretty drastically depending on different families' rules. As I mentioned, we really encourage that video games only be allowed in shared areas. So we really encourage parents and caregivers to remove the video games from kids' bedrooms and put them in the family room or the den or anywhere that parents can more actively just view kind of what is happening. This is also very important as video game consoles get more and more advanced. Kids can access the entire internet from video game consoles. And so parents also need to be aware of what are they doing on those consoles, both gaming-wise and otherwise. As always, parents should be modeling healthy video game usage, enforcing total screen time limits, and making sure that they are balancing video games with other activities and other hobbies. We also want to ensure that video games come after required activities. So homework should be done, chores should be done. We've done our extracurriculars, whatever it is that needs to happen needs to come before video games. And this is really for a variety of reasons. A, video games and screen time in general should be a privilege, not a right. So we want kids to view this as a privilege that they are earning rather than something that they are entitled to at any given time. We also know that, as I mentioned, video games and screen time are highly stimulating and are very rewarding. So it's hard for kids to transition from a highly rewarding and exciting activity to maybe doing something that isn't so enjoyable, like homework or doing chores. And so that transition can cause a lot of conflict in the home. So as a whole, we just encourage, get all the not so fun stuff out and the required stuff, get it out of the way. And then we can earn our video games and our screen time as a reward for that. Okay. Any questions about video games? It's a very quick overview. Okay. I'm going to keep
Simmons, should we just let them open up to a question on video games? Because I know that is definitely one of those areas that parents are very concerned about and such. So if you want to if you're an attendee here and a provider, if you'd like to open up your line and unmute yourself to ask Dr. Simmons a question, feel free to do that now.
Yes, before we jump to anything else, would be happy to answer questions. Okay. If anything comes up, feel free to put it in the chat and I will continue to kind of keep an eye on that and address it as we go. Okay, so now we are going to talk about everybody's favorite topic related to the impact of technology on sexual behaviors. So I will preface that I think everyone kind of recognizes sexual development as sometimes a more taboo and uncomfortable topic to talk about with parents and families. However, I think that this is incredibly important, and we're going to talk a little bit about why. So before I jump into this, I want to define what we mean by pornography. So pornography is defined as professionally derived or user-generated pictures or videos that are intended to sexually arouse the viewer. The videos and pictures depict sexual activities to various extents. So we can have things that are implied all the way to very explicit. So the vast majority of young adults have been exposed to online pornography in some way, shape, or form. So if you can see our nice little picture, 93% of teen boys have been exposed to pornography and 62% of teenage girls. And it's currently estimated that about 43% of young adults regularly view pornography. I will caveat all of these statistics by saying this is an incredibly difficult topic to research. Because research with children and adolescents is just trickier, but given the specific nature, it's often very taboo and uncomfortable for kids to be answering questions about pornography usage. So as kind of a rule of thumb, we often assume that these numbers are underestimates of what is actually happening, especially because a lot of these studies were done pre-COVID. So we have to always keep in mind that internet usage and potential exposure to sexually explicit material increased just as screen time and internet usage increased during the pandemic. So with all of that being said, it's estimated that about half of boys and 40% of girls actively sought out pornography the first time they saw it. And the vast majority report that curiosity was their main motivation for doing so. So we can assume that about half were exposed inadvertently. So that could be through pop-up ads, through searches, through, the rabbit holes of clicking through YouTube and ending up somewhere you're not supposed to be. But the large majority reported that upon first viewing pornography, they felt curious, shocked, and confused. It's also important to remember, again, we kind of talked about how much material is available on video game consoles and other ways, but it's important to remember that pornography has changed over time. Whereas older generations may be used to magazines or like physical DVDs or things like that, it's estimated that about 84% of content is accessed via phone, and there's also a high percentage that is accessed via video game consoles. So there is a lot of easy access. So each year, Pornhub, which is a major pornography site, publishes a Safe for Work year in review. I will caveat this with Texas has banned Pornhub currently, so I could not pull the most recent numbers, but we can extrapolate from the 2019 data. But I just think these numbers are really jarring when we look at just how rapidly the amount of sexually explicit material is growing. So from 2017 to 2018, the number of visits increased from 28.5 billion to 42 billion. And in 2017, there was about 4 million videos uploaded. So it would take you 68 years to sit down and watch every single one. By 2019, that had increased to 6.8 million videos and 169 years worth of content. So I think the main takeaway is just, and this is one site, is there is it is very, very easy for children to access pornography and sexually explicit materials. And so we need to be keeping in mind that it's really no longer a question of if children are exposed to pornography. It is a question of when they are exposed, how are we going to respond? It's, as I mentioned, pornography itself is also changing. So again, I just thought that this was an interesting graphic, again, published by Pornhub's Year in Review. So in 2019, and I circled just some of the terms that kind of stood out to me, but some of the most searched terms included hentai and anime pornography, so pornography based on anime or manga characters, teenage cartoon. And so if we think about how many of our patients are interested in kind of these types of media, or just how they could accidentally be Googling something related to anime and end up on something that is sexually explicit, I think is important for us to keep in mind. And in 2022, hentai pornography was the #1 searched term. So again, this is incredibly prevalent. It's easy to come across, whether it's being sought out or it's accidentally being kind of stumbled upon. So again, why is this concerning? How does pornography affect youth? We know that pornography can affect the adolescent brain in some pretty distinct ways. So first, when viewing pornography, it leads to a stimulation of the amygdala and the HPA axis, which essentially causes the prefrontal cortex to go offline. So we see a decrease in those executive functions, including impulse control, social skill, good judgments, all the things that we need to make smart, wise, safe decisions. The more that pornography is viewed, the more the brain can develop neural pathways that favor impulsivity and self-gratification, because that prefrontal cortex is going offline more and more often. We also know that the pleasure center in the brain has an exaggerated response when viewing pornographic materials. There's an increase in dopamine in the brain, which is highly rewarding to youth. And beyond brain changes, there's also some distinct things that are happening that can be concerning. So some early anecdotal research has shown that youth may use pornography as a form of sex education. So if they are not getting that information in school or from their parents, they're often seeking it out from peers, from Google, or unfortunately from pornography. This is especially relevant in states like Texas, where schools are offering abstinence-only sex education. So if they're not getting developmentally appropriate sexual education at home, they're usually not getting it anywhere, unfortunately. Now, this is a problem because, as you can see, as youth get older, there's a higher and higher percentage of those who are reporting that they would like to emulate or copy what they see in pornography. So they may think that it is more realistic. They may have more positive attitudes towards casual sex. However, we know that bodies depicted in pornography are not realistic, and porn sex is not safe sex. We also know that pornography has become mainstream and significantly more aggressive. So 88% of scenes included physical aggression and 48 scenes contained verbal aggression. So again, this is concerning when our youth are turning to this as a form of figuring out what is normal in a sexual relationship. So as I mentioned, this can, viewing pornography can lead to some unrealistic sexual values and beliefs. So girls specifically report feeling physically inferior to the women they view, while boys fear that they may not be able to perform as the men do in this media. And adolescents report that those who use pornography have lower self-confidence as their development increases. We kind of touched on some of these others, but I wanted to spend a minute just touching specifically on the possibility of a pornography addiction. So there's a number of terms that are used to describe problematic pornographic usage. So we may call it compulsive viewing, impulsive viewing, a hypersexual disorder. But overall, we have to think of behavioral addictions differently than substance-based addictions. So it's not a physical addiction to a substance, but rather a compulsive behavior that is detrimental to a person's well-being. At present, the DSM has not included sexual addiction or a pornographic addiction, largely just due to lack of evidence and empirical research. But it's largely believed that a pornography addiction may be classified as an internet addiction disorder rather than its own standalone diagnosis. Regardless, we want to consider pornography as an addiction or as problematic when viewing becomes obsessive, compulsive, and starts to interfere in normal daily behaviors. So if we are cutting off times with friends, if we are starting to see our grades drop in school because we are choosing to view pornography, that's when we start to be concerned. If you suspect a pornography addiction, I would highly recommend a referral to a licensed provider who has experience treating adolescent addictions. So, what do parents do? Again, this is a taboo topic. It's an uncomfortable topic for a lot of parents to discuss. However, it is still really important for us as providers and for parents and caregivers to be talking about in just a straightforward manner. The first thing that we can do and that parents can do is just understand how pornography and sexually explicit material is changing, and really just being aware again of how easily accessible it is to adolescents. So again, going back to that idea of we can't say, oh, well, like we'll deal with it if the time comes. Unfortunately, in today's world, that's not really an option. We need to be planning for it when the time comes. Parents also really need to understand local laws about child-produced explicit images. So for example, sexting or sending sexually explicit images is illegal in Texas, even if no adult is involved. So if one teenager is sending a sexually explicit text or video or a picture to another teenager, that is still considered illegal. Now, it is a misdemeanor. There are some protections put in place. So, if they're in a relationship and sending those messages, there are some protections. Where it gets a lot trickier is if those photographs are shared further or further distributed, are used for revenge, anything like that, the penalty then becomes a felony. So we kind of very quickly get into this territory of adolescents being at risk of a legal felony without parents even being super aware. So I always bring that up with parents of like, hey, do you know what your local laws are and kind of what these terms even mean? The biggest thing that parents can do is monitor, and just be aware of what their kids are exposed to. So again, keeping things in a shared space, taking away phones at night, and paying attention to all forms of media. So tablets from school, laptops, video games, phones, et cetera, et cetera. This is also where parental control apps come in really useful. I always just recommend that parents do kind of keep just additional checking and monitoring. Our children and adolescents are digital natives, and they are very good at navigating parental controls. So just keep that in mind. Again, be aware of what kids are watching. When we have families in treatment, we have them do an activity where they spend time watching what their children watches and paying attention specifically to adult content. And they're typically pretty shocked by what they find and just by the frequency of, whether that be language, alcohol use, cigarette use, drug use, sexual materials, anything like that. They're usually pretty shocked how frequently that's happening. Again, we want parents to be having open, honest conversations with their children about what appropriate online behavior looks like. I included a link here, and I'll include the link to the larger resource, but this is the National Coalition for the Sexual Behavior in Youth. And they put out a really useful parenting newsletter that's really gives some just very good tips on how to talk to your kids about pornography use, about online behavior, all that fun stuff. It's written by parents for parents, which is really useful. And we want to be encouraging parents to have a response plan in place when a child encounters inappropriate electronic content. So many parents aren't prepared to answer uncomfortable questions and may react pretty strongly and negatively just because they're shocked or uncomfortable. The problem with this is that it discourages youth from bringing up future questions. So we want to help prepare parents to address these sensitive topics in just a calm, age-appropriate manner. And the more that parents can be doing this and also providing age-appropriate sex education in a proactive manner, the better. At the end of the day, I think most parents would prefer that their children come to them with questions rather than relying on Google or their peers or worse, pornography for sexual education. But that precedent really needs to be set and those conversations need to be had early for them to be effective. So quick questions. At what age can it be a felony to send images over the internet? So that I'm going to answer to the best of my knowledge. I am not a lawyer, so please don't quote me on this. It's going to depend on how those images are being sent to the best of my knowledge. So I think at any age, if a sexually explicit image is being sent to an individual, that is not a felony. What becomes a felony is, let's say girlfriend sends boyfriend a nude image, and then boyfriend distributes that to his friends. That's when we're looking at it becoming a felony, is that secondary distribution without the original person's consent. So that's where it starts to get a little tricky. But I don't think that there is an age limit to those minor produced images. Yes, and I agree. Another area to check would be reading materials, self-published ebooks, fan fictions. Yes, fan fictions tend to be highly sexualized. So even if you think a kid is reading, Harry Potter or something else that's young adult related, once we kind of get into self-published things, knowing the specific content is very, very important. So how do we talk to parents about this? As allied health professionals, it can be uncomfortable to have these conversations. However, I think it's important that we are keeping it at the forefront of our mind, because we know that almost every single adolescent who walks into our office is going to be exposed to the internet. So these topics and conversations really need to be a normal part of conversations with parents, rather than waiting until something inappropriate has happened. So we really just want to be putting it on the forefront of parents' brains to think about how much screen time their children is allowed and what specific content they are viewing. The more that we can present information in just a factual, straightforward manner, the better. The calmer that we are, the less taboo the topic will seem. I'm not going to say that we have to be thrilled about discussing pornography use with the families that come into our offices. And again, the more proactive that we can be, ideally we can get ahead of some of this problematic usage. Consider having handouts available to provide to parents. Parents and all of us, we forget things that we're told in offices. And so the more written materials that we can be providing them with to take home, the better. And beyond that, we also know that they're going to be the ones having the majority of these conversations. So, providing them with resources and equipping them to have these conversations is hugely important. As we talked about, we need to normalize the prevalence of inappropriate and sexually explicit material on the internet. Just to help parents understand that, again, this is not, we need to address that if the time comes, we need to address it for when the time comes. We as providers can stress the importance of creating an individualized plan for each child. As we talked about, maturity level is going to vary drastically from child to child. So when they are ready for things, what they are ready for is also going to vary drastically. We also want to consider what is realistic considering families' resources. So some of our lower SES families may not have the resources to enroll their kids in a lot of extracurriculars. And so we have to sometimes get a little creative about what does safe screen time look like when that's kind of their go-to or their main option for entertainment. And then I really encourage conversations about values that apply to all family members. And I'll kind of give you an example. This is a worksheet that I give to a lot of families. And it's related to both just, internet usage as well as kind of sexually related internet usage. And it's just a very simple tool to help parents kind of and caregivers have discussions about at what point do we think this is appropriate, or do we ever think that it's appropriate? So at what age do we think kids need to have their own smartphone? When is it appropriate to be sending sexually explicit messages via text or email? But again, the more proactive that families can be in having these conversations and determining what their family values are, the easier it becomes as their children get older and come across some of these situations. I always tell families it's much easier to have a plan in place and not need it than a situation come up and be scrambling to figure out what it is that you believe, what's okay, what's not okay, and then trying to communicate that to a child. So a few additional resources for parents. The Family Media Plan is an online resource created by the American Academy of Pediatrics. And it's a great resource to help families create a safe plan for children's media usage. So I highly recommend that to families as they are kind of in the process of getting this plan into place. NetSmarts is online safety education, and it provides age-appropriate videos and activities to help children be safer online. So again, thinking about what information is safe to share and not share. Some others, It's Time We Talked provides resources for youth and parents specifically on adolescent pornography usage. Internet Matters is kind of just related to all aspects of child well-being. And Family Online Safety Institute provides a lot of resources to promote good digital parenting. Common Sense Media is kind of cool. It rates games, movies, TV shows on a variety of domains. So instead of just giving you a singular rating, it rates related to things like sexual content, drug use, language, to help parents make more informed decisions about what their kids can or cannot be exposed to. And then finally, I mentioned the National Center on the Sexual Behavior of Youth. It's based out of the University of Oklahoma Health Science Center. Is a really fantastic resource just for professionals and parents to promote healthy sexual behavior in youth. That is where I pulled both the family values worksheet as well as the newsletter that is published for parents by parents. Okay, so that was very quick. But wanted to leave a few minutes to just open up the floor for questions, concerns. Yeah, good point. Common Sense does come from a conservative Christian lens. There are probably other sites out there, but yes, do be aware of that if families don't prescribe to a more conservative Christian lens, that one may not be a good thing for them to use, or they may just not find it helpful. But that is all I have. I will open it up to questions. So feel free to unmute yourself, put them in the chat.
Thank you, Dr. Simmons.
Of course.
We would love to go ahead and have questions at this time if you would like to share, either through unmuting yourself or from the chat. Dr. Simmons has been great at really gathering the answers for your questions in the chat throughout the session. But you have access to a psychologist right here on the phone right now. Would love to have you pick her brain, challenge her.
I'll do my best.
Uh-huh.
Thanks. And I think copies of these, the copies of the slides will be available if you even just want them for some other resources or anything like that.
Yes, if you would like copies of this in a PDF version, I'll go ahead and put the email in the chat that you can send to our CPAN CME email, and we will get that sent off to you.
If there aren't specific questions, I'm also happy to give people 5 minutes back to your very busy day. But I am happy to hang out and answer questions as they come up. Okay. Your thoughts on helping teens and families verify the identities of others their teens are on. So this is a great question of just related to verifying identities, specifically to online gaming sites. This is tricky, and I've heard families approach this from a variety of different ways. Because at the end of the day, it is sometimes impossible to verify the identity of specific people. One specific rule that I sometimes recommend is families will say that like they're only allowed to play with people from school. So if they get friends from school usernames, they are allowed to play with them. That is probably in my opinion, that's just my opinion, kind of the safest way to do it. Because at the end of the day, like I said, there is no way to verify identity, unfortunately. Now, another approach that some families will take is just being very clear about what information is safe to share and not share. So, you may be allowed to chat about what you're doing in the game, but you're not allowed to share your name, where you live, your age, anything like that. So again, I think the larger recommendation goes back to just being aware of what your kids are doing online. Just because I think it gets really tricky to have hard and fast rules when we as adults can't even verify identities. I know that's not like a super clear answer. When you discuss social media use in minoritized groups, do you recommend specific sites? I don't know any specific sites off the top of my head. I mean, Reddit and Tumblr is obviously going to have a lot. I think Facebook tends to be a little more restricted. Like at least there's like kind of questions that can be answered. Again, I would say the biggest thing is just parents need to be aware of like the content that their kids are consuming. Also because those groups are going to change so rapidly that as a rule of thumb, I really just kind of preach that idea of just be aware of what your child is doing, because things evolve so rapidly that it's often difficult for us to kind of keep up with very specific site recommendations, because there's going to be 10 new ones that come up in the next hour. So just be aware of what your kids are doing. You're welcome. Other questions? Like I said, I will hang out for a few minutes. But I guess if there's nothing else specific, we can go ahead and wrap up. And like I said, I'll just kind of hang out. And if other questions come up, I'm happy to answer them.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Simmons.
I
do want to go ahead and mention we do have another session coming up on I believe it's the 13th of May. Let me pull this up real quick. I don't want to misspeak. on the 13th of May. You had actually mentioned circadian rhythm, so you gave us a nice segue into the next one. We have one of our second-year child psychiatry fellows that will be presenting a session entitled entitled 4 hours, 10 minutes, and 48 seconds, the impact of circadian sleep-wake cycle on the pediatric patient. So it'll be great. Dr. Samadi does a fantastic job as a second-year fellow here, and we are looking forward to that session. I hope you can join us for that. If you are already registered with CPAN or with PeriPan, you will receive the invitation in your email for that session. And we hope that you'll be able to join us for that one. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to email us at the CPAN email address above in the chat. And if you have any additional questions for Dr. Simmons, you can send them to that email and I'll forward them off to her as well. Dr. Simmons, thank you so much for presenting today. I really appreciate it. You do a great job. And we had a wonderful turnout today, and look forward to having more sessions with you in the future.
Thank you. Thank you all for your attention, and please let me know if there's any additional questions I can answer.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Y'all have a great one.
Thank you.
Bye now.